You don't lose people because you're broken. You lose them because you stop betraying yourself. And no one warned you that truth would feel like exile. You think awakening will be a rising, some kind of triumph, but it begins as a quiet collapse. The laugh doesn't land like it used to, the conversations feel thinner. You start to notice the space between words, the pauses that stretch too long, the way people stop asking how you really are. And one day, without drama or goodbye, you realize you're not being met anymore. You're being managed. Not because of a fight, not because of failure, but because something invisible has shifted. You've changed, and they haven't. It's disorienting. You search for logic, for blame, for a moment you can point to, but there's none. Just a slow, aching drift, like a boat untied from its dock, moving with a current neither of you can control. You remember sitting across from someone you once loved deeply, someone who knew your middle name, your history, your heart, and you shared something that mattered, something vulnerable, and they just blinked, smiled politely, changed the subject. And that's when it hit. The version of you they loved wasn't the one speaking now. Psychologist Carl Jung once said, loneliness does not come from having no people around. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that matter most. That's the fracture. That's the silence that stings. Not because you're alone, but because your truth no longer has a place to land. You've started speaking a language your old life was never designed to understand. This isn't about superiority, it's about resonance. You're tuning into something deeper, something quieter. You're shifting from validation to vibration, from fitting in to coming home. And as that signal clears, the static around you becomes louder. The spaces you once called home now echo with dissonance. The warmth starts to feel conditional. The closeness starts to feel performative. And eventually, you're not sure if you miss them or if you miss the version of yourself that they still expect to show up. The grief isn't just for them, it's for the you who stayed small to stay loved. The you who laughed to avoid silence, who nodded along to avoid rupture, who agreed with things that buried your voice just to keep the peace. But you're not at war anymore, you're just waking up. You didn't push them away. You just stopped pulling yourself apart to stay close. And yes, it hurts, but this isn't the death of connection, it's the rebirth of truth. You're in the same room, with the same people, surrounded by the same stories, and then one day something feels off. Not wrong, just misaligned. You laugh at the joke, but your smile arrives late. The words are still friendly, but they land without weight. The rhythm is familiar, but your presence feels like translation. That's how it starts, not with a dramatic rupture, but with a subtle resonance shift. You've changed, not on the surface, internally, quietly. What once excited you now drains you. What once bonded you now bores you. The conversations feel like echoes from a version of yourself you no longer remember how to perform. And when you try to share what's moving inside you, what you're starting to see or feel or question, it doesn't land. You watch their eyes glaze. You hear the nervous laugh. You feel the temperature change. It happened once when I tried to talk about how I'd started meditating again. Not the kind of casual mention you drop into small talk, but a real confession. How it helped me sit with emotions I didn't know I had. How the silence started feeling more honest than most of my relationships. I watched the friend across from me smile, tilt their head and say, "That's cool, man," before quickly moving on to weekend plans. I wasn't offended, but something in me collapsed. That moment didn't hurt because they were cruel. It hurt because I realized I was no longer speaking the language of that room. I was becoming a stranger in a place I once called home. This is what people mean when they talk about frequency. It's not pseudoscience, it's pattern, it's presence. You're no longer vibing with environments that require you to be dishonest about what you feel. You're no longer a fit for dynamics built on mutual avoidance. And here's the hard truth. When your signal changes, the receivers change too. People who once resonated with your survival patterns might no longer see you at all. And the grief that comes with that isn't just social, it's cellular. It's a death of the illusion that you could grow and still keep everything. But growth isn't polite, it doesn't ask for permission, it deconstructs, it disrupts. It reveals the conversations you can't fake anymore, the masks you can't wear, the settings where your silence used to feel safe but now feels suffocating. This doesn't mean you've outgrown people because you're better. It means you've outgrown the version of yourself that needed to be less than whole to be loved. You're not being distant, you're being honest. And honesty isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just walking away from what no longer echoes back who you are. At first, that feels like loss. But eventually it starts to feel like breathing. Because the moment you stop needing to be understood is the moment you make room for those who already understand. Not because you translated, but because you finally spoke in your own voice. It starts subtly. You say something honest, something new, something real, and the air changes. A pause, a laugh that doesn't feel warm, a look that lingers just a little too long. You brush it off, but your body feels it before your mind can name it. They don't say it outright, they don't have to. You've become unfamiliar, not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer holding back the parts of yourself they needed you to hide. What used to bond you, mutual coping, shared denial, unspoken agreements, has begun to dissolve. And in its place, silence. You've stopped flinching at your own truth, and that makes you a mirror. Not the kind that flatters, the kind that reflects what others aren't ready to see. I remember sitting with someone I'd known for years. We used to talk endlessly, complaints, jokes, gossip, everything and nothing. But something had shifted. I'd been doing the work, therapy, solitude, silence. The surface level talk began to feel hollow. I brought up something deeper, about how I'd realized I wasn't just tired, I was emotionally bankrupt. How I was no longer okay pretending to be fine. How I was questioning the roles I'd played just to be accepted. She blinked, smiled, looked down at her drink, then said, "Wow, that's heavy," and changed the subject. And in that moment I felt it, the glass wall between us, unspoken, cold, irreversible. She didn't attack me, she didn't ghost me. She just couldn't walk with me past the place I used to live. This is the hidden cost of growth. Not everyone wants the real you. They want the you who helped them avoid themselves. Carl Jung called this process individuation, a return to wholeness by reclaiming the disowned parts of yourself. But when you become whole, you stop fitting into relationships built around your fragments. Your boundaries become threatening to those who relied on your compliance. Your clarity feels sharp to those still in fog. Your healing disrupts the delicate ecosystem of dysfunction you both once survived inside. You don't even need to say anything. The mirror does all the work. The resentment that follows isn't about who you've become, it's about what you're no longer willing to be. A few will lash out, others will quietly fade. But most will hover just long enough to make you question yourself. They'll call you cold, distant, arrogant, dramatic. But what they really mean is you're no longer manageable. They didn't love the whole you, they loved the version of you who agreed to stay hidden. And now that you're visible, you've become inconvenient. You didn't betray them, you just stopped betraying yourself. You didn't reject them, you just stopped abandoning your truth for connection. There's a Japanese fable called The Crane Wife. A man marries a woman who turns out to be a crane in disguise. To stay with him, she plucks her own feathers and weaves them into fabric to support their life. But over time, the cost of hiding her nature becomes unbearable. When he discovers the truth, she's forced to fly away, never to return. This is what happens when love requires invisibility. And when you finally stop plucking your feathers to stay close, some people will call your wings betrayal. Let them. You're not selfish for changing. You are not cruel for healing. You are not broken for wanting more than performative love. Let them project, let them misunderstand, let them leave. You didn't lose them, you became someone they never took the time to see. And that is not your failure, it's your freedom. There is a moment in every transformation when the noise fades and nothing replaces it. No new people, no new comforts, no new answers, just space. It doesn't feel sacred, it feels like loss. It feels like being left behind by a world you no longer know how to touch. This isn't loneliness the way most people describe it. This is something more existential. It's standing in a crowded place and realizing you have no one left to call. It's hearing your own thoughts echo in the stillness and wondering if silence is the only voice that will answer back. This is the part of the journey that breaks most people. The part they don't put on podcasts or healing retreats. It's the abyss. You didn't mean to end up here. You were just trying to be honest, trying to evolve, trying to tell the truth about what hurts, what's changed, what no longer feels real. But honesty stripped away the distractions. Growth burned the bridges you didn't know were made of dry timber. And now you're here in the empty aftermath. You begin to ask impossible questions. Did I go too far? Was it worth it? If this is what healing looks like, why does it feel like death? There's a myth that lives in every culture about the one who descends. In Greek mythology, it's Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, who loses her daughter Persephone to the underworld. In her grief, she wanders the earth alone. The crops die, the world grows cold, winter begins. She doesn't scream, she doesn't rage, she just goes still, silent. A sacred kind of broken. That's what this chapter feels like. You don't cry because you're fragile. You cry because everything that was false has fallen away. And what's left isn't weakness, it's the weight of finally carrying only your truth. You might feel ashamed for still missing the people who couldn't stay. But grief isn't a sign that you chose wrong. It's a sign that you loved with depth, even when they couldn't meet you there. You're not failing for aching. You're proving that you're still alive. This kind of solitude is not decorative. It doesn't fit in a highlight reel. It's raw. And that rawness will try to convince you that you've ruined everything. That you should have stayed quiet. That you should have stayed small. That you should have kept dimming your light just a little longer. But don't believe that voice. That voice is old survival. That voice is the echo of the you who didn't know your worth yet. There's another voice underneath it, faint, steady. The one that says, stay here, not forever. Just long enough to let the silence become soil. Just long enough to let your roots find something real beneath all the noise that used to tell you who to be. Hafiz wrote, don't surrender your loneliness so quickly. Let it cut more deep. Let it ferment and season you as few human or divine ingredients can. This is not a detour. This is not the breakdown. This is the chamber before rebirth. The space where your soul stops contorting itself to be understood and begins simply to exist. And when you stay here, when you choose not to numb or escape or run, you begin to feel something else. Not the return of what you lost, but the presence of what you were always too crowded to notice, yourself. What begins as emptiness slowly becomes something else. At first you call it isolation, you call it exile, you call it loneliness. But over time something shifts. Not because the pain leaves, but because something sacred enters. Space, unclaimed, unoccupied, unfiltered space. You stop rushing to fill the silence. You stop reaching for the old noise. You begin to sit still long enough to hear your own voice beneath the voices of who you were supposed to be. And in that voice, something ancient stirs, a knowing. This is what solitude reveals. Not answers, not ease, but an honest mirror. A mirror that reflects you without needing to please anyone, without asking you to twist or smile or soften to be loved. It's uncomfortable until it's not. Because the longer you sit in that honest stillness, the more you begin to notice what's been growing in the quiet. Clarity, discernment, a spine you didn't know you had. You begin to remember the moments you used to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You remember shrinking, smiling, swallowing things that were too big for their comfort. And you realize that that was never connection, that was performance. There's a Japanese art called kintsugi, repairing broken pottery, not by hiding the cracks, but by filling them with gold. The breaks are not flaws. They are part of the story. The fracture doesn't ruin the vessel. It reveals the places that held the most pressure and still survived. Your life is not ruined because something broke. Your heart is not ruined because someone left. Your identity is not invalid because you had to walk away. This solitude is not a sign that you're unloved. It's a sign that you are being reassembled. Not in the image of who others needed you to be, but in the shape of who you really are. The old you needed attention to feel seen. The new you is learning to be witnessed by silence. The old you feared being misunderstood. The new you understands that being known is less important than being whole. And when you become whole, your energy changes. Not in a mystical way, in a biological one. You stop chasing rooms where your value must be proven. You stop performing for those who only loved the edited version of you. You stop bargaining with your own intuition to keep connections alive. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop trying to be found is when people who can truly see you begin to appear. Not because you hunted them down, but because you became visible to those who speak the language you no longer apologize for. They don't flinch at your silence. They don't ask you to translate your soul. They arrive gently, not to fix you, not to fill you. Just to walk beside you, because the path they walk is shaped by the same fire. This is the gift of solitude. It doesn't make you stronger by hardening you. It makes you softer by telling you the truth. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You're not alone because you're flawed. You're alone because you're clearing space for a life built on resonance, not reaction. So let it be empty, let it be quiet, let it be sacred. This isn't a waiting room, this is the becoming. You return quietly, not to the places you left, not to the people who faded, but to yourself, the version that waited patiently beneath every performance, every compromise, every carefully timed smile. This is not the return the world expects. There's no grand reveal, no applause, just a slow, steady re-entry into your own body, your own breath, your own knowing. You look around and see differently now. Not because they've changed, but because you have. You no longer need to be understood to belong, because you finally understand yourself. The longing for old validation fades. The ache to be seen softens. You no longer contort yourself to remain palatable. You no longer walk into rooms hoping they'll recognize your truth. You walk in already standing in it. And something happens when you do. You stop being magnetic to people who need you to stay small. You start attracting those who recognize you, not for your usefulness, but for your wholeness. They won't demand an explanation. They won't need a backstory. They'll simply nod in recognition. Not because they understand every detail, but because they too have been through the fire. You feel it in the way they listen, the way their silence holds space, not judgment, the way you no longer have to armor up to feel safe. These are the ones who don't just meet you. They meet themselves through you. But here's the deeper truth. Even if they don't come right away, even if you're still walking mostly alone, something fundamental has changed. You are no longer afraid of your own company. The silence that once screamed now sings. The loneliness that once crushed now clears the air. Because solitude isn't empty anymore, it's full of you. And when you reach that place, you don't go back. Not because you couldn't, but because there's nothing left to go back to. You outgrew the mask. You outgrew the need to prove. You outgrew the version of yourself who kept editing their soul for temporary connection. Clarissa Pinkola Estes wrote, "It is worse to stay where one does not belong at all than to wander about lost for a while, looking for the psychic and soulful kinship one requires." This is what you were doing all along. Wandering not to escape, but to unlearn, to unmask, to return not to comfort, but to resonance. And now, standing in the stillness that once terrified you, you understand what you didn't at the beginning. You didn't lose them when you found yourself. You lost the illusion that belonging meant betrayal. You lost the idea that love should cost your voice. You lost the belief that silence must be filled to be meaningful. This wasn't abandonment, it was alignment. This wasn't exile, it was emergence. And now there's nothing left to chase, nothing left to force. Only the quiet magnetism of a soul that no longer begs for entry, but opens the door to those who've learned to walk through truth. So if you're still in the silence, if you're somewhere between the ache and the clarity, let this be your reminder. This is not the end, this is the becoming. If this spoke to you, leave one word below. A word for the next person walking through the dark. A word for the version of you that almost turned back. A word for the quiet ones learning to make peace with their own voice. Because somewhere out there, someone is still trying to understand why their truth feels so lonely. And your word might be the first light they seek. So if you're still in the silence, if you're somewhere between the ache and the clarity, let this be your reminder. This is not the end. This is the becoming. If this spoke to you, leave one word below. A word for the next person walking through the dark. A word for the version of you that almost turned back. A word for the quiet ones learning to make peace with their own voice. Because somewhere out there, someone is still trying to understand why their truth feels so lonely. And your word might be the first light they seek.